Have you ever wanted to do a painting of your house? This is a commission that I received, but I wanted to show you kind of the steps that I take to make a painting. I printed a picture of the house on paper, and you can see I've taped down my watercolor paper that I'm going to use. I have a ruler ready, straight edge, and I also have some carbon copy paper, or graphite paper works as well. I'm going to go ahead and place that down, and I like using an embossing tool. You can see it in my hand there, but you could just use a pencil too for this part. I'm going to line up my house where I want it, and then I'm going to use just some small pieces of tape to make sure that my picture doesn't move. And I don't put a ton of tape on, just a little bit on each side, because I do like to check to make sure that I am not missing any areas. So I kind of like to pull up my picture in the middle to make sure I didn't forget an important line here or there. Now this is an embossing tool, and I like it because it has a really thin tip, but you can just use a regular pencil or a pen for this step, and that's fine too. I also like using a triangle as opposed to a regular ruler in case I ever need a 90-degree line. I sped this part up because it's kind of a tedious section, but as you can see, I just go through, and especially the larger, more important lines, I use my ruler and mark all of those on there. This part is essential too in making sure that I am picking out what things to include, what things to leave out. I am going around the front bushes and a little bit of the side house, but I'm not doing much detail like in the trees or the background. I'm lifting up my paper every once in a while to make sure that I have everything. And once it's all done, I'm ready to paint. Now I started off painting the background, and the sky color, you can see I dropped in a little bit of green for the tree, and I'm using a purple and yellow combination for the ground. I'm filling in the windows with some shades of blue, trying to go a little darker for the lower windows since they're hidden under the rooftop. Next, I'm filling in some of the main greens of the house. I wanted to slow down a little bit so you could get a little bit more detail. I'm trying to pay attention to the darkness and the lightness. The greens on the top part of the house are getting more sunlight, so I try to leave those a little bit lighter, where the darker greens would be on the bottom of the house. The greens would be darker because they would not be getting as much light. I'm even adding a little bit of blue towards the top just to give a little bit of extra shading. As I work on my house painting, I kind of jump around from section to section, making sure that I'm not working on two sections right next to each other that are wet. That gives them a chance to dry before I am painting right next to them. So when I did the sky too, I made sure to do that, and then I jumped down to the ground, and then I jumped to the windows because none of those things were touching. And the same thing goes here. I'm trying to kind of work on one little section at a time while other sections are left to dry. Now I do like to be looking at my reference photo. Even though I have everything drawn in, it helps with shading. It helps with me to decide what is important to keep and what's important to get rid of in my picture. I usually start off a little bit lighter. As you can see, these bushes, I'm using a pretty light green, and then I will go back in later and darken it with a darker shade of green. The paints I'm using are Shinhan Pro watercolors, and I've just poured they come in a tube, so I just poured them into these palettes. They're really nice. I like the vibrant colors. I'm adding a little bit more of darkness into the bushes here, as you can see. Wanted to make sure to give them a little bit more depth. I'm also adding some greenery by the door. There's a little pot there. and then also on the other side too. Now this pot didn't have anything in it, but I'm using my artistic license, and I added some greenery in there as well. There's also a little table that's on the deck, but I left that out as well because you could only see just a little section of it kind of behind the post, and it was kind of confusing. So there's certain things that you just have to choose to leave out, and I figured the 2 chairs would be there just fine on their own without the table. Next, I wanted to start getting some color on these front pillars. They have like stonework. So I'm using kind of a creamy, warm color, like yellow ochre mixed with some white. I don't often use white, but sometimes white can make some of the other colors a little creamier. So I decided to mix some of that in with this. Right now I'm just trying to get main color on. I'm not worried too much about some of the stone details. I'll add some of that in later. There's a little fence back here that I wanted to kind of indicate, so I'm throwing a little bit of color back there. It's really hard to tell with this one. And another thing too, when working on house pictures, this one you can see there are no leaves on the trees, but I usually like to paint, you know, as if it were a nice summer day, so I had to just kind of make up the greenery on this one. But thankfully, because those trees are in the distance, I don't have to worry too much about getting too detailed. I just kind of throw some blobs of green, and the fact that there are trees back there is plenty clear. I'm adding a little bit of color to the rooftop, which is a little bit of blue and brown mixed. Gives it kind of a nice grayish tone. And then I also wanted to indicate some of the dirt or the mulch under the bushes here in the front, so I'm trying to give that a little bit more of a bold color since that's something that's a little bit closer to the front of the painting. There's some greenery kind of back by this mulch and this fence, so I left a little space there, and hopefully we'll fill that in with some green. So some of these things you just have to kind of guess or do your best to figure out what goes where. Side yard, I'm going to add some green grass. And then back over here, I'm just going to throw some bushes in. I can't really see too much detail, and again, they may not have their leaves because of the time of year. All right, I did want to give a little bit more color to this house, but I'm not going to make it quite as dark as what it is in my reference photo because I want the greenhouse to be standing out as the main feature. So I want to kind of keep the tones in the background a little bit more muted. I'm throwing a little bit of paint on the steps here to show the difference. I wanted to add a little bit of shading. I'm also adding some of the same color. It's kind of a grayish tone to the pillars to make sure that those have details as well. And I'm throwing in a little bit of stonework or brickwork just by adding a couple brush strokes here and there, horizontal, to make them look like stones. I don't want to get overly detailed on this. A couple brush strokes here and there is enough to give you the idea. Now the trim around the windows and some of the other details of the houses is not bright white, so I wanted to make sure to kind of create this like warm toned color. And to do that, I just mixed my yellow ochre with some white again. And I'm trying to look for areas that are darker and lighter in the trim of the house. And of course, anything under the shadowed area would be darker, so I'm trying to use a little bit more pigment there. And then we'll save some of the lighter and creamier colors for the areas of the house that get more sunlight. I'm using a pretty thin brush for this as these parts get a little bit more precise. But you can already see that that adds a lot of depth to the house. I'm also trying to pay attention to areas of the house that are in shadow, like up on the top part of the roof. There's some sections that are a little darker. So I want to pay attention to anything that would be a little bit darker. And then anything that would be lighter. There's a lot of trim work, so I'm just making sure to fill all of those areas in. Make it look nice and neat. I will be going back over the entire thing with ink because that really gives it a nice solid finishing touch. I found that on houses that I just leave like this, they're fine, but I feel like they're just so much stronger with the ink line. So as I do this too, I'm not so worried about making my line work super precise because I know I will be going back in with pen after I am finished adding all of these details, and that will help a lot to really define the lines. I'm taking a little bit of a bluish gray mixture and I just wanted to darken a little bit more, like under the roof line where there's getting a little bit more shadow. Just to make sure that's nice and dark. I even wanted to do that a little bit more in the shadowed area where the front porch is. I couldn't forget the front door too, giving it that nice warm wooden tone. And then I'm just looking for areas where I can add details. So the pot was a warm tone. I am painting in the chairs. They are green and blue, so they match the section of the house. And you can see right now they're all just kind of blending in together. So that's another thing where this line work later will really help us understand what's what, and it'll kind of help define those shapes because the greenhouse and the blue windows and then the chairs and the pillows all being the same, they kind of blend together some. I wanted to add a little bit more shading under these bushes to get some of those really nice rich darks in there. Kind of pull that forward. Starting kind of along the bottom edge where the shadows would be. I wanted to make sure that those were solid. I did want to indicate a little bit of the tree trunks, but I don't want it to make them too dark because, again, they're in the background. They're not the star of the painting, so I just want them to be kind of subtle. I'm adding a little bit more detail with the trees. And you can see I don't have anything to look at, so I'm just kind of making it up, picking some areas to have lighter or darker. Trying to darken some of the areas right next to the house so that the house pops forward. I also wanted to do a little bit more detail on the side house. I'm just filling in some of the window areas. And I just wanted to define some of that a little bit more, but again, not much because I really want my house in the front here to be the star of the painting. I have two different pens that I use for this part of the picture. Right now I'm just actually using a thin point Sharpie, but I also have like these micron pens that are really nice, and I will use that for some of the smaller details. I could go back in and use a ruler in this point of the picture and make sure that my lines are super straight, but I prefer just to eyeball it. I've already used my ruler to draw most of these lines, so just by tracing over them as carefully as I can is usually good enough to make the lines work. I am just trying to kind of go in and get the important details. I'm definitely not getting every last thing exactly right, but just the main important lines to give a good, nice, solid structure to the house, and to define the shapes and the edges to make sure that they all make sense. It's kind of a tedious part at the end, but it makes such a difference, and I feel like it's incomplete without the line work. So I do really like the effect that it has and really adding those finishing touches. Now, some people actually prefer to do the line work ahead of the time. So you start off by putting all of these ink lines in right away, and that totally would work too. This is waterproof ink, so you can always go back over it with water, and that's kind of nice. But I don't know, I like saving it for the end as like a nice little finishing touch, icing on the cake type thing. I'm switching to my smaller pen here. It's a thinner line. This is like a size 0.1 or something, so it's pretty small. And I use it to do the siding on the house. And then you can see, I thought the windows should be a little darker, so I'm just kind of going in and painting a couple extra things, adding some extra little details with the brush, going back in with the pen, back and forth until I'm happy with the final results. And then usually I like to add the address on the front as well. So there you have it. Thank you so much for watching with me today, and I hope that this gives you the courage to paint your own house.